Marhaba, shalom and welcome to the exciting podcast Israel and Palestine Unpacked that is dedicated to exploring the complexities of the ongoing political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. Throughout this podcast, we will explore unresolved issues, the human cost and the diverse experiences and perspectives of those directly affected. These discussions demand sensitivity as the emotional weight of the topic cannot be overlooked. So far, we have focused primarily on the personal stories of individuals, their experiences, struggles and views, which provide valuable insights into how lived experiences shape perceptions. Moving forward, in the near future, I aim to engage with academics, historians, journalists and writers who have examined different dimensions of this complex political landscape. Additionally, we will highlight the significant contributions of peace organisations, both locally and globally, whose work fosters understanding and offers paths towards reconciliation. This podcast approaches the subject from an academic perspective, striving to unpack and better understand the issues at hand. I am not a journalist by trade, and my interviewing skills are continually developing. With each conversation, I aim to grow through self-awareness and constructive feedback. While I may occasionally miss opportunities to further explore claims or subjects, I view these moments as steps in a learning journey that I hope will make each episode more insightful. Finally, it is important to emphasize that all views expressed are those of the interviewees alone, and do not necessarily reflect the views of this podcast. Before we begin, I would like to give a special thanks to Connery McCulloch for taking the time to edit this episode during a busy time in my life. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr John McMullen, an educational and child psychologist based in Northern Ireland. Dr McMullen has worked extensively with war-affected children in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and currently supports refugee pupils in Northern Irish schools. He also lectures on trauma, conflict, and the refugee experience. Our conversation begins with how prolonged exposure to violence shapes a child's emotional and cognitive development, and how trauma manifests differently across age groups. Drawing on his experiences in East Africa and Belfast, Dr McMullen offers a grounded psychological lens on how early trauma becomes embedded in the developing brain, shaping how children view themselves and others in the world. While his research is rooted in specific regions such as Uganda and the DRC, his insights reveal something universal. Trauma transcends borders. So whether it's a child in Gulu, Gaza or even East Belfast, the psychological effects of violence are strikingly similar. This generalisability opens up space to explore shared risks and opportunities, especially in long-standing conflict zones like Israel and Palestine, where children live in segregated societies often shaped by inherited fear and mistrust. We also discussed resilience, what it looks like in children exposed to war, and whether it can be cultivated through education. From integrated schools in Northern Ireland to classroom interventions in Uganda, Dr McMullen shares lessons with relevance far beyond any one context.
My name is John McMullen. I am an educational psychologist. Was formerly a teacher before that. I'm an ed psych. I'm currently working at Queen's training educational psychologist, so I'm the program director for the doctorate in child, adolescent and educational psychology at Queen's University in Belfast. Alongside that, my research is mainly focused on working with war-affected children, so former child soldiers in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for a major research, and also in northern Uganda, and also a bit of work with children and young people with refugee and asylum seeking experience here in Northern Ireland, and particularly in schools. So that's been the kind of work that's been going on alongside that.
So just out of genuine curiosity, what actually drew you to working with children affected by conflict, particularly Uganda and the DRC?
That's a good one. I could take all day exploring that. Funny, I probably only found out some of the almost subconscious things that pushed me towards that in recent years. But initially, it was going to Uganda. Involved with the Irish charity called Fields of Life, and we would have gone out there and brought out teams and doing voluntary work. And in one of the years in 2006, we went to northern Uganda where there'd been a really horrific conflict, but the conflict had just recently ended, but it was just in the immediate aftermath of it. And we met a lot of people that had been impacted by that, and it had a huge impact on me. And that was just before I was going into doctoral training. So, and I'd kind of resolved before I went into the training that I would do my major research looking at something to do with helping children and young people in a culturally appropriate way that have been impacted by war and conflict. So then while I was doing my training on the course that I now lead, we did some work in northern Uganda with former child soldiers, and then we did our major research in the DRC, working with local people there in designing, delivering, and evaluating interventions to support trauma-focused interventions to support former child soldiers and other children that have been affected by the conflict there.
So, in your experience, how does prolonged exposure to conflict affect a child's emotional and cognitive development?
Yeah, in many ways, trauma is the one that probably will come to most people's minds, and it probably should. Trauma is the most prevalent and the most researched aspect, impact, symptom, whatever you want to call it, of war and conflict. But there's a whole range of others in the research and in what we've seen in practice as well: depression, anxiety, abnormal kind of grief reactions, academic impairment, physical, somatic symptoms, aggressive behavior, kind of loss of childhood almost, and this kind of typical moral development. But really, I'll come back to trauma probably in this, but really, with the young people we work with, if you had the young people that have been through some of the most horrific trauma you can imagine, especially in the DRC, and probably beyond what you can imagine, if you asked them what their main biggest challenge was, they would have talked about the daily stressors, the social difficulties, educational opportunities, food, shelter. Education was a big one. Those were the things that they would have talked about rather than their trauma symptoms, really. Yeah, coming back to your question about prolonged exposure, um, I do a lecture on this, so I'll not get into the whole lecture, but people are familiar with the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that there's kind of three kind of clusters of symptoms around that. So there's the intrusions, the nightmares, the flashbacks, kind of reenactment of what's happened to them. That's the first. Then avoidance, which obviously comes from how intense those intrusions, those flashbacks are. So avoiding anywhere that could stimulate or stimuli associated with the trauma. And then the third one is kind of hyperarousal, hypervigilance, sleep problems, poor concentration, kind of an exaggerated startle response, and the irritability and aggression, everything comes in under that. So that's PTSD, but there's a lot of research would say that that isn't really that relevant or applicable to children and young people, especially children and young people that have experienced prolonged exposure to violence, which is what your question was, because we would use the term not just with war-affected children, but with children that have had other prolonged exposure to trauma, and we talk about complex trauma, and that talks about more multiple trauma over time, and the PTSD kind of symptomatology doesn't really describe the impact that complex trauma can have because it can impact cognitive development, language, motor skills, behavior. Complex trauma kind of describes exposure to multiple prolonged traumatic events and then the impact of that exposure on their development, which PTSD doesn't do as much. And that prolonged exposure can, not for everyone, not for every child, but it can result in just the loss of safety, the loss of direction, the ability to detect or respond to danger cues, and it can set off this kind of chain of events leading to subsequent repeated trauma exposure in adolescence and adulthood as well.
Yeah, so do symptoms, like for example, while you were talking, I was thinking about adults, but I was also thinking about multi-generational as well.
Hmm.
In what sense is trauma or the symptoms of trauma, how do they manifest differently in adults or in children than they do in adults?
I think that the key part of it is the impact on development. In some ways, it's similar to adults. I'm saying that those symptoms of PTSD, the flashbacks, the avoidance, um, they don't fully describe prolonged trauma, but we do see it, and we see it across cultures. There's a debate in the literature about this, but I have seen it in Palestine. I've seen it in remote Congo. I've never heard of these terms. You see these responses in children and in adults. But I guess the primary difference with children and adults and adolescents, which is something I've looked into, especially with the young people, where they're at that formative period of development of their moral development, of working out who they are, where they fit in the world, of their community, of good and bad, and all of those things are happening in adolescence, and that's exactly what the leaders of the rebel groups that would have abducted or recruited child soldiers really kind of preyed on, because they were at that formative stage, and they're in their eyes they're kind of pliable in some ways,
Yeah,
through trauma exposure.
yeah. It's interesting because you and I are both from Northern Ireland,
Mhm.
and I've heard from friends who are doctors regarding PTSD, trauma within the context of the Northern Irish conflict, and how there are a high percentage of people who are older than us who are on Valium in parts of Belfast and across Northern Ireland in general as a consequence of their experience, whether directly or indirectly during the Troubles. It got me thinking over the years regarding myself living in East Belfast. It would have been a place that historically, coming from a nationalist background, I would never have actually set foot in because there was that sense of fear that you were entering a place that was other. These particular things or beliefs are things that get into us at a very early age. And you talk about teenage years as well. And thinking like from a psychological perspective in terms of neuroplasticity, you've got those early particular developmental stages in the first couple of years of children's lives. But also, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but that there's a similar element of neuroplasticity that occurs within kids in their teenagers as well.
Mhm.
Like that leads me to imagine that those particular experiences, those beliefs get in under your skin and become an inherent part of your psyche and how you actually navigate the world.
Yeah.
When you think about the Israel and Palestine within that context, are there particular long-term psychological risks for children growing up in chronic conflict zones like Gaza, like southern Israel around Gaza, but also we could say in northern Israel on the border with Lebanon, where there have been displacements as well within Israeli society?
Yeah, I think without a doubt. I mean, it's interesting that you refer to the conflict here. That you and I, when we were younger, it was just our everyday life, and it was kind of normalized. I remember bringing friends over from England when I was quite young, and they were totally shocked by the army being on the streets and carrying weapons, and I hadn't even realized, hadn't even noted, just those totally are normal. So there's part of that, but also, in recent events in Gaza, there's nothing can I can't actually imagine, even having worked in conflict zones, I can't imagine what the levels of trauma are like in Gaza and in those areas of Israel that you refer to. But if you think about Gaza in particular, a young person aged 17 in Gaza has experienced 5 periods of intense bombardment in their lives. 2018, 2012, 2014, 2021, and then the current one for past year and a half. And I was just looking at some stats that I'd mentioned in a class. In 2012, UNICEF found that 80% of children were either continuously or usually in fear of imminent death. 91% had sleep disturbances, 94% slept with their parents. That was in 2012. In 2023, before the current conflict. Psychiatrists in Gaza had said children had developed serious trauma symptoms such as convulsions, bedwetting, fear, aggressive behavior. The lack of any safe place has created a general sense of fear and horror among the entire population, and children are most impacted. And that's before the current conflict, where, as we know, there's all the displacement that's been going on. Most of the people that have been killed are civilians. And I was reading something the other day saying Gaza has the most amputated children per capita in the world. I was listening to a speaker recently that was saying that there is no PTSD in Gaza because it's never post. It's just ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't imagine what it's like there. And I'm sure the threat of the children living in Israel as well along those border areas, there's no point in getting into any comparisons really, is there? But overall, the children are always impacted by conflicts more than anybody else. The ones that are playing any part in it are the ones that are most impacted. In any conflict in the world, it's the children that bear the brunt of the men usually going to war.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, how an individual's politics and worldview, and I'm sure religiosity for some within particular certain contexts, can influence the trajectory of a person's life. Now, in Northern Ireland, we have a small but growing integrated education model. My kids are in integrated education. I'm not now trying to fly the flag and say that it is the perfect model or that it's the only social pillar that will help us to emerge into a post-conflict world. But within the Israeli-Palestinian arena, because Palestinian societies in Israel are segregated from one another, but also in terms of inside Israel, where Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis are often educated separately from one another too. In a place such as Israel and Palestine, where education is overwhelmingly segregated, what risks and opportunities do you yourself see, John, in that?
I'm not sure I could speak to that as much with any authority. Integrated shared education isn't something that I've researched myself, but in an intuitive level, and from what I do know, we talked before we came on the podcast about all parts contact hypothesis and bringing people together. I mean, it just makes sense, the dehumanization, the otherness, the stigma, the mental pictures that we have of other people develop when we don't know them. And until we do know people and hear their stories, and realize that we're all the same and equal human beings, it's difficult for me to find much hope of moving forward in divided societies without that. I mean, interestingly said, that integrated education is growing here, but if it's growing, it's very slow, isn't it? I
Yeah,
think it
very
was
much so.
7% of kids went to integrated schools in 1998, and I'm not sure it's much higher than that now. Although shared education has definitely developed over the last number of years, and schools working together in a deeper kind of way.
Focusing on yourself and your work within East Africa, what lessons do you think from these contexts might apply to children affected by conflict in Palestine and in Israel? Are there universal principles?
I mean, I can talk about some actual kind of programs and interventions that can help, but I think I could probably circle back to your last question on that one, on the role of schools. So we mentioned about schools bringing kids together, which you would intuitively feel would help, but also I can speak more about the impact of schools from a well-being perspective and from recovery from trauma. And I've seen that in my research, and also, I suppose, in reading the literature to prepare classes and things, and in my work as an educational psychologist and before as a teacher. Schools can play a really powerful role, and often it's just in the very basic things that a good school or a good enough school just naturally provide, and can be a real benefit to children and young people who've experienced trauma, because their process of adjustment for children is different than adults, and children often can do a lot better and recover a lot better than adults partly because of school, and their lives are significantly normalized by going to school. And what children need after trauma, Potentially they need some therapeutic intervention support, but what they need immediately and what they need more importantly than anything else is structure, stability, safety, a secure environment, a predictable routine, clear expectations, consistent rules, all the things that schools do in and of themselves is the most important thing that kids need, whether that's in the Congo, in Gaza, or here for refugee and asylum seeking kids coming here. But schools are also provide they're a good place to help children feel that the trauma reactions are normal reactions to abnormal events. Also, they're brilliant opportunities to intervene with parents, to bring parents in the school because they can be a part of the community. But the most important part, that's the most important things the school provide is connection, it's community. We're social beings. The worst catastrophes that befall us involve relational loss. So the research would say that, like say, a natural disaster is less likely to result in traumatic distress than war or rape or something like that, or relational trauma. And that means that recovery has to involve reconnection, re-establishing human connections. And a lot of psychologists, even clinical psychologists who do therapy, would say that the most important healing experiences often occur outside therapy and inside homes, schools, and communities. And that's where I have this wee quote in one of my classes that resilience resides in relationships. When we talk about resilience, it's within those relationships. So that's the kind of that I can talk about other things, but that is one kind of general principle, I think, in relation to schools and recovery.
Yeah, you used the word resilience there. What does psychological resilience look like in children exposed to war from your own personal experience, from whether that be in the classroom in Northern Ireland, whether it be through research or whether it be through your experience of living within the Middle East and in East Africa? What would it look like?
It's a difficult question and one that I've wrestled with for a number of years because I find resilience a very difficult concept to define, first of all, but especially to measure. Initially, the research I was doing in the Congo was trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavior therapy interventions. But what I had actually previously wanted to do was to look at resilience, but I couldn't find any way to design and measure it from a research perspective. Our general understanding of resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity or bouncing back. And we absolutely see that the majority of children that have experienced traumatic events don't display trauma symptoms. So there's something there. Not all kids that have been through traumatic events are traumatized by them. I would say that they're impacted by them. You bear the psychological scars, but aren't displaying the symptoms of trauma. So how or why are they not, or why are some so terribly impacted and some and others less so? Is a difficult question. I've kind of moved, and I think the research has moved away from seeing resilience as a trait that we either have or we don't have, to seeing it as a kind of as a process, and a multifaceted process, and something that's kind of bi-directional as well. So there are individual psychosocial factors that impact resilience levels, but there's also, I suppose, emerging evidence of bidirectional relationships between healthy communities and more resilient individuals, which kind of feeds back into what was said about schools earlier. And I think that's really important because it means that resilience can be promoted and developed. It's not something that people either have or don't have. We can play a role in that. And ultimately, what makes children resilient, at least the way I try to describe it to our students, and we get them to think about it, but it's basically like a balance, like an old kind of style of balance that you would weigh your food on when your ingredients on when you're baking. And on one side, you've got risk factors, and on the other side, you've got protective factors. Because the risk factors are cumulative, as we talked earlier about the prolonged impact of trauma, social disadvantage, and it's like a dose effect response. The more stressful life events accumulate for children, the more risk they are of developing trauma symptoms and other symptoms. And then that almost needs balance by protective factors on the other side. And then we would be encouraging in working with schools, encouraging them to be able to recognize, identify symptoms, but also the risk factors, and then have an understanding of what are the protective factors that we can put on the other side to try to balance that scale in order to find some kind of in order to develop resilience. Really, that's how I kind of conceptualize it. Other people may think differently about it.
So, in terms of resilience within the school setting, is it possible that the concept and practice of resilience can be taught in schools? Are there any examples of that in Northern Ireland or in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo or Uganda, in your experience?
I know I'm not sure about Congo or Uganda, and I wouldn't even attempt to do it there without working with local people because that's going to look very different in every cultural context. Here, yes, there are programs that do attempt to teach resilience in schools. I am not aware of a great evidence base for those. More that I'm not aware, rather than it's not there. I'm not sure. To be honest, I think it's more resilience. I kind of feel it as more of a systemic thing, rather than something that can be taught. I'm sure there, as part of that, there are kind of strategies, like with CBT, there are strategies that children can have as part of their repertoire of skills to help them cope. Absolutely. But when I think of coming back to Gaza again, when there's ongoing conflict and people aren't safe and there's nowhere safe, then I'm not sure you can go in and teach resilience skills. Because
Yeah,
even some of the trauma, it's complex because even some of the things that I described as trauma symptoms are protective if you're living in somewhere that's dangerous. Avoidance of potential danger, hypervigilance, hyperarousal. Those things could be potentially keeping you safe if you're in danger, but they can have a really negative impact psychologically when it's prolonged over a long period of time. So sometimes I would be a wee bit concerned that some programs are a bit oversimplistic when they try to address these things.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. No, I understand that. If there was something that could be changed, like a particular policy or a set of policies regarding conflict in Israel and Palestine, what would you suggest from an educational psychologist's point of view?
I think first and foremost, there needs to be far more done by the international community to protect children and young people in situations of conflict. Um, there's just not enough happening. I'm kind of, a bit fed up of, doing intervention work, downstream, and I'd love to do more upstream, around preventing these conflicts or from escalating. Ultimately, that's it. I suppose coming back to your original suggestion, I suppose to wrap it up, when you're talking about resilience and talking about the impact of trauma, and our work, as I said, is focusing specifically on traumatic distress and trying to reduce levels of that. But what we've realized is you can't do that on its own. So the work we did in the Congo, for example, we were working alongside other NGOs that were meeting the young people's basic needs, basic physical needs, food, water, clothes, shelter, and the emotional needs through social interaction, vocational or educational needs, either going to school or giving them some vocational training. I think that overall is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically, you can't just do psychological intervention in a vacuum without without providing the basic needs. Um, and otherwise, in working in other contexts, it's ensuring that all you do is culturally appropriate, it's sustainable, it's based on identifying need and not just labels. Looking at the other factors in additional to kind of war exposures. Um, Often there's too much of a focus on kind of psychopathology rather than the social community level on building resilience and accounting for the role of family and community in that. Um, so those are some of the things, and I suppose the last thing from a research perspective, it's going out to an academic audience. It's making sure that what you deliver is evidence-based and rigorously evaluated, because lots of stuff that I've seen working in low and middle income countries, there's a lot of money and it's just thrown into something that isn't evaluated, and you don't know whether it's making a difference or if it's doing harm. The first do no harm principle, and the same in schools here. Often schools don't have the time to be researching something that's offered to them, so it's really important that others around are making sure that the things that are being implemented, actually we know that they're going to that they work, that they can make a difference.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. John McMullen for such a thoughtful and generous conversation. His insights into trauma, resilience, and the lives of children affected by conflict have given us much to reflect on across borders, generations, and worldviews. Before we go, I'm excited to share a little bit of news. I've begun work on a new series exploring the city of Jerusalem, its layered histories, identities, and contested meanings. Interviews are already underway, so keep your ears open, it's coming soon. Thank you for joining us today. If you find this conversation meaningful, please consider subscribing or following the show. It helps others find us and ensures you won't miss future episodes. If you have any thoughts, questions, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. A simple review can give the podcast a much-needed boost. You can email me at Israel-Palestine-Unpacked@gmail.com or connect with us on Facebook. And if you have a moment, rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen really helps us grow. Until next time, take care and thank you for listening.